right, so in a previous video, we took a look at the exploring ways that we can use third-party plugins for optimizing the phase between multi-mic'd sources. Now, this could be things like, for example, drums, or maybe percussion, or in other cases, maybe you have an electric guitar or a bass, and you have multiple microphones that are connected or that are miking up the cab, and then you're taking a line out. So anything like this. And I basically spoke about a third-party plugin that I like to use, which is Auto-Align. Now, I've pulled in some tracks out of a current mix that I'm working with, I guess because I wanted to show how you can do this manually. Now, I mentioned something in the previous video, and I kind of wanted to revisit that. I said that anything that was either, for example, like maybe 3 tracks or over, I guess that's not the best way to have stated it. You can optimize the phase manually for tracks if you can read waveforms. You can do that for as many tracks as you want. You could take a crack at if you had 10 different drum tracks and you wanted to use the waveforms to align things and then try to read the actual waveforms, which would indicate whether you need to invert the polarity on a specific channel, which is very easy to do in Studio One. But what I wanted to do is show how you can do it manually because you don't need to buy a plugin. But also, once you have a plugin and once you have, and your mixing and time is money, sometimes even if it's only 2 tracks, I will still use Auto-Align because it's really easy. And whereas I can get it pretty good by doing things manually, in certain cases, Auto-Align or any third-party plugin that does something similar can do it perfect. So I've got 2 drum tracks over here, a kick in and a kick out, or marked here bass drum out and bass drum in. My OCD is killing me. I'm gonna reverse the order. I always like to have in then out. I wanted to show how I would go about doing this. And also I've got some conga tracks. We'll take a look at those as well. Now, notice that I do have Auto-Align over here. And notice that this one is set to receive on 3. So my guess is that bass drum out. Yeah. So the way that I'm doing this is I'm using sidechain send 3. So this becomes the kind of like the guide for alignment for the kick drum signal. And then on this one over here, I'm receiving the sidechain send 3. So my bass drum in is being aligned to my bass drum out. Now I can also tell you that my bass drum out was being phase aligned to probably 1. That's probably the snare. Hard to tell because I only pulled in these 2 tracks, so it's a little bit out of context. But let's take a look at how we would do this. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom these into view. I'm going to use my scroll wheel. Take a look at these 2 tracks over here. This is our bass drum in and this is our bass drum out. Now, if I was to go in, for example, let's change from bars for a moment. Let's change to samples. And now I'm going to just make a highlighted selection across here. And this would be essentially the distance here. This would be the distance between the 2 of these would be right over here. So if we now take a look at this is our sample counter. I'm going to use my locate cursor. Notice what the samples say here, 256, 76, 69. Now I'm going to go to the end point. This is 256, 77, 41. So the difference between the 2 of those is basically, in general, that's basically the difference between the alignment. Now, I could go over here, and I can tell you over here, in terms of samples, this said 177, and there was no polarity invert. But if I was doing this manually, and I only had 2 tracks, and let's put it into context of maybe I wanted to use 2 small diaphragm condensers on an acoustic guitar. They were maybe 18 inches away, and one was pointing kind of towards the sound hole, and the other was pointing maybe towards the 18th fret. And they were in a little bit of they had a stereo spread to them. If I brought in both of those tracks and I was looking at them, it is possible to align these simply by nudging. Now, I'm going to give you a couple tips. One thing that you can do is you want to make sure that you're snapping over here. You want to make sure that this is set to off. First tip is make sure that you have enable crosshair cursor for tools on. If you don't, it makes it a lot harder. So for example, if I'm moving this, if I click the cursor, I can see the relationship, but as I'm moving my mouse across here, I can't really see anything. I find that it's incredibly helpful if you have this tool on, then I can actually see, because what this allows me to do is I have a really nice transient, and I've chosen this for a specific reason because it's really easy to tell. The transient detection, or rather the waveforms themselves, it's really easy to see the transients of these kick drums. So I can see that if I wanted to do a data zoom, if you need to adjust anything, we can click this over here. I can either bring this up or down. So let's bring this up quite a bit. maybe about up to there. And I'm going to zoom in even farther. Now let's go just to where it stops in terms of filling in the solid color over here. What I can see is that we have a positive waveform here, we have a positive waveform here. If I was aligning this manually, the easiest way to be able to do this would be quite simply to click, hold, and drag this, and then just move this by eye, and I would move it to about... Here's the deal when you're doing this. It's not just about making sure that the beginning is perfectly aligned. We also need to take into account, let me bring my data zoom down a little bit. We also need to take into account the length of this wave cycle that's coming down on the negative side. Notice that these 2 points, you're going to do a lot of data zooming, either zooming in or zooming out to make sure you can see a lot of detail in these waveforms. You kind of have to average things out. And so in between the cursor, if I place my cursor here, or if I place my cursor here, you can see that this is a really good start. Maybe I need to pull this out a little bit, and then that creates a better alignment for the center of the peaks, not necessarily for the very beginning of the zero crossing point, but the peak in terms of where it's at its highest value. Now I'm going to just do one more data zoom over here. Now let's place our cursor in the middle here, and notice that this is a pretty good phase relationship between these two on the downward side. So let's choose some other ones now, and basically the way that you want to do this is you want to find something that across the board looks pretty good. The meat and potatoes of everything, especially a kick drum, could be on that front end transient. So I'd say that this would be a good starting point. Now let's say, for argument's sake, that instead of having this one over here, instead of having the peak going like this, that the peak was in the exact opposite order and it was going like that. In fact, you know what? Let's just make this even easier, and let's go to the browser and we'll go to the effects, and I want to search up for the mix tool. And let's drag this as an event effect. Let's drag this on here. I'm going to hold down the alter option. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the invert button, okay? And now I'm just going to render this. And we'll notice the change that happens here. Now let me zoom in again, and let's take a look at this. This is what I'm talking about. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you were looking at these waveforms and you had this relationship between the two of them, that this one was going on the upwards and this one was going downwards, and it's the exact opposite. In those cases, if you don't want to do what I just did, which is dragging a mix tool to the actual audio event and then rendering it to change this, then a really simple thing that we could do is we could just invert the polarity directly from the channel controls. And the way that we find these is you want to be choosing, where is it? Is it input controls? Yeah, input controls. As long as this option is enabled and as long as your view is high enough, you will see the polarity. So you don't necessarily have to drag a mix tool on and invert things, but I just find that it's a little bit easier to do. But one other thing to take into consideration is, let's see how many audio events we have for this bass drum. Okay, so in this case, it's just one contiguous audio file, but sometimes you might receive a session, or you might be working with a session that has multiple audio events, in which case you'd have to drag a mix tool to each one of those and invert them. So let's actually restore this, and I'm also going to remove this. So like I said, that's one way to do it, where you just click, hold, and you drag and you move the actual events. Now, the thing to take note of when you do this is take a look at what happens when we zoom in really, really tight, is that I've actually changed the relationship of this. Okay, let me try to undo to bring this back to where we were before I moved anything. Okay, so this is where we started off with. I want to show you one other way, and this is something that I find to be really, really helpful. As long as you have a top and tail, as long as you have information before the audio event that can be pulled out, in this case, I do, and as long as you have information at the very end of the audio event that can be pulled out, in which case I do, then there's another thing that we can do, which is basically using slip editing. Now, the reason I like to use slip editing is because it leaves all the edit boundaries intact. So if we took that exact same approach and we were using slip editing, instead of click, holding, and dragging to move the actual audio event, I would hold down, I'm on a Mac here, so it's Option and Command. And if you're on a PC, that would be Alt and Control. And in this case, I'm going to click, hold, and drag. And I'm just going to do the exact same thing I did before. I'm just going to slip this over. And like I said, it's not always about perfectly aligning the zero crossing. That's not always what it is. That is the onset, or not the onset. It is the zero crossing point. If we zoom in super, super tight, we can see that this is where the audio started to come. exactly at the zero crossing point, but you're not necessarily interested in exactly the zero crossing point. Sometimes on really spiky transients where you've used a similar mic and it's just a kind of like a left and right perspective for width, the waveforms might look close to identical. But if it's something like a kick in and a kick out, for example, then you always want to be kind of averaging things out. So you want to kind of move things so that the center of this peak over here and the center of this, we want to kind of split the difference and get it to work for both of them. Once we get it to work for both of them, and once we can see that the waveforms are actually aligned, then I would say we're on a really, really good path here to optimizing the phase between these two relationships, or between these two channels that were recorded. Now this one, like I said, the zero crossing point over here, take a look at where it is. The zero crossing point over here, it's a little bit earlier. But what I'm concerned about is getting a good average between these two waveforms, because the front end transient part of this kick drum track, if we isolate either one of these, let's have a listen. It's got a lot of punch, not this particular kick, but it's got a lot of punch and it's got the transient, and it will have low end if it had low end and it was recorded that way. So like I said, just about averaging things out. Now, this works really well for two tracks because you only have to really worry about one track. But take a look at this other example that I've pulled up over here. In this case, we have 3 congas. Now, I have a conga low. Let's have a listen. Sorry, that's coming out of the left. Let me actually turn this up a little bit momentarily. Okay, now let's listen to the conga high. Okay, and then I actually have an overhead as well. Okay, so in these cases, it's a little bit more difficult because we have to discern which one we want to be the main alignment, and we have 2 things to concern ourselves for 2 of the tracks. The easiest way is to just leave one of them exactly how it is, and that becomes what you align to. So that's in terms of the waveforms, in terms of whether you have positive waveforms coming up on the wave cycle versus the negative one that goes underneath. And in addition to that, it has to do with the delay. Now, the delay is accounted for because the microphones are different positions away. There are some rules that we have when we're miking things up. Like a really simple one would be, you could Google the 3-to-1 relationship between microphones and a source. You try to keep them at least 3 times the distance apart from each other as they are away from the source. And that can help with phase where you won't have any weird anomalies. But when we take a look at stuff where we're just kind of throwing microphones up, we may run into the scenario where, like I said, you have multiple mics. In this case, we have an overhead perspective of the congas. We have a conga left and we have a conga right. Let me zero these out and let's listen to each one on their own. And let me also, let's go like left 45 and right 45. We won't go too far out. So let's listen to this one first, which is this one over here. Okay, now we'll listen to the high one. Now we'll listen to the overhead. Now I'm actually interested to see what I did here for auto align. Let's see. Okay, so for this one, it's receiving from sidechain send 4. And what about this one? Okay, so in this particular case, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I chose to use the conga high as the guide for the other 2 tracks, which means that I'm using the sidechain send 4 within this plugin, and then that's being received by the conga low. And then you can see that there's 28 samples of offset, and we didn't need to invert the polarity. And then if I go to the overhead track, let's see what this is happening here. Here we have, 101 samples of delay. And again, we didn't need to invert the polarity. So I chose to use the conga high as the actual track that was being used for the alignment, if you will. Now, if I was doing this manually, it's going to be the exact same thing that I did in the previous example. The difficult part here, well, it's not really difficult, you just have to be aware of it, is that in this particular microphone, I can hear the conga low, but I also hear the high hits. So you see these big ones? This one? These are all the low hits. Now in the conga hits, the waveforms or the transients that are in the middle here are the big ones on this track because the focus of the microphone was for the high one. And then all the lower level detail stuff represents the low ones. So in this case, we need to make a decision. And the difficult part here is being able to read the waveforms, because sometimes they might be a different level and it's kind of hard to read them. So if we take, for example, the overhead as a guide, let's take a look at the phase in terms of the overhead of everything. I can see over here, and again, this is where your data zooms come in really, really handy. So I can see the general phase of everything, and I'm looking for kind of like an average picture on these. So here's a low one right over here. And like I say, this is where the crosshair tools really come in handy. I'm going to zoom in on my timeline, and I want to see, I notice that there's a little dip underneath here. So it kind of starts off in the negative, but then the first one is positive, and then 3 in, we have quite a big positive waveform. So I can see over here that the alignment in terms of this one over here, keep in mind, I remember, just because we just opened up, that there was a 100 sample difference that the plugin applied, where it was basically pulling the overhead back in time. This is another thing to take into account. You have like room tracks and overheads, for example. If you have something that's mic'd, let's say that you had 2 microphones that were pointed right at a set of congas, and they were kind of balanced on the edge and they were spread across, kind of capturing the top of the skin. If you had an overhead mic that was 4 feet above, of course that sound is going to arrive later, so the waveforms are going to show up later. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're out of phase with each other, but what this will do is, because there's a delay in the overhead sound, and also the microphone might be picking up some ambience, that it creates the ambience in the actual track. Now in this case, there's not a lot of ambience in this overhead. There's a little bit, and arguably, if this mix was really dense and I didn't need to have a really focused sound for those close mics, I could easily get away with just using the overhead track, and I could mute these ones, or maybe use the overhead track and then dial a little bit in. Now, in the other case, I could just treat the overhead as if though it was a third microphone, which is kind of what I did in this particular example, or at least judging by the way that I've used auto align. Now, if I was phase aligning these, it would be simply a matter of basically making sure, first of all, that going by probably the overhead, and then making sure that everything kind of looked in line in terms of the way everything is. Well, I can see that everything starts off in the negative, and then the first transient is kind of this up one, and then the third one spikes a little bit higher. So let's say that I was trying to align these two together, then I might just kind of average things out. These actually don't look too bad at all. Like, take a look at these peaks. If I kind of average this out and I put this in the center, notice that, like I said, we're not always going to get a perfect zero crossing point at every exact point over here. And this one it lined up, and this one it's close. This one is kind of close, but we can get like an average. So what I might do in this particular case is just like pull this back just a little bit, and then I might take the overhead, if I wanted to treat the overhead less of like a room mic, but more of, how do you say it? More like just, it's like it's a third mic. Then I might actually move this back a little bit. And then my goal here would be to be using this to try to align all 3 of these transients like this. In this case, it worked out well for us because we don't have to invert the polarity of any of these channels. But this is just 2 simple moves that I've made. Now, obviously, the thing we need to take into account is we need to make sure that if we just did this move, which was a slip edit, we just did this move on just this one event. So if I wanted to do it across everything, I would need to make sure that I'm, for example, holding shift, double click, holding shift and double clicking selects all of the events. And then, like I said, we can do that same level of zooming in, but now because we've selected all those events, now when we zoom in, just like this, we're actually moving all of these. It's kind of hard to see, but if I was to do, let's go like this, for example, you can see that I'm moving everything from within. So that is how you would go about manually phase aligning multiple tracks, whether it is just 2, or technically speaking, you could do as many as you needed to. The one main thing to be aware of is averaging out your waveforms in terms of the peaks and the valleys of the positive waveform and the negative waveform in terms of on the top half or the bottom half. And then the other thing is certain things that are ambient mics or room mics or things like that where it's distant or an overhead, it might not necessarily, you might not necessarily need to move that. But you could try, for example, to invert the polarity and see if things sound better or more full in a certain way. Or if you're just hearing that things are sounding weird and the center is a little bit off, then you could try shifting things a little bit, but I'd say as a starting point, work with inverting polarity in those tracks. Anyways, that's it for this video. I hope it helped. We'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.